All righty. Well, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Really happy to have you all with us. My name is Charmaine Campbell Patton, and I'm joined by my father, Michael Quinn Patton. And we are happy to get going with our monthly webinar series, which is based on the 5th edition of Utilization Focused Evaluation, which was the first intergenerational UFE publication that we co-authored. And so we're doing this series of webinars to introduce you all to the work and have a chance to explore some of the principles and themes that emerged out of this edition. This is the cover of the book, which features cattails, which we chose because in many indigenous communities in North America, especially, cattails are a plant that have been used for centuries, many uses. They can be used for food, for diapers, for shelter. And so we thought it was an appropriate symbol of utilization and utilization-focused evaluation. So we're happy to be celebrating with you all the use of evaluation and the imagery of cattails. Michael, do you want to show your shirt, your cattail shirt? We really go big when we pick a theme. So there we go. We've got cattails on the shirt. I've got some behind me that are kind of blurry right now, but so we're happy to have you all with us. And we'll just begin with land acknowledgement. Utilization-focused evaluation's roots are in Minnesota, Makoche, Minnesota, the homeland of the Dakota people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Many Anishinaabe also call this land home, having followed the Migas shell to the food that grows on the water, which is wild rice. Indigenous people from other Native communities also reside in Minnesota and have made innumerable contributions to this beautiful region. Michael and I are settlers on this land. Our ancestors came to what became the United States from Ireland, England, and Scotland. They participated in and benefited from the attempted genocide of Native people and enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans. Despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, we know that this is still Indigenous land. It will always be Indigenous land. We also know that we have a responsibility to interrupt the generational legacies of colonialism, racism, and genocide that we continue to benefit from, and to do better. And we wanted to share this map. This is a map of the Twin Cities by Dakota artist Marlena Miles that shows the land in and around this area. Michael's a little bit north of here, but this is where I reside. And Marlena Miles is a Dakota artist, and so we wanted to acknowledge her work and the land that we're on. And we also have made a commitment to redistributing the royalties from this edition of the book to support Indigenous language scholarship and movement building. So these are two organizations that we plan to support with the royalties from this book. And we also want to acknowledge that this book launch is taking place, or not this book launch, but this webinar is taking place during the Lunar New Year celebration, the year of the tiger. And the tiger embodies courage and bravery. So we want to wish you all resilience and strength as we enter this new year, and look forward to entering in conversation with you. And we also have one more important historical event taking place during this webinar. I'll turn it over to Michael to share about that.
In the United States and in some other countries, this is Black History Month, where the theme is Black health and wellness. We know that there are great disparities around the coronavirus and other health outcomes for low-income people versus more people with more income, for people of color versus white people. And so a part of utilization-focused evaluation is to take into account whatever the context is. I've started doing some video blogs on Black History Month, and we'll be doing a series of video blogs on other topics like the Olympics coming up. I'm putting in the chat a link to the my video YouTube site where you can see these blogs and subscribe to get notice of them. There'll be quite a few coming forward here. And the more subscriptions there are, the more visible these things become. So I'd appreciate any subscriptions you care to make to the YouTube video blogs on utilization-focused evaluation as we go forward. We're also acknowledging in the context of COVID that a week ago, my longest and dearest hiking friend, Malcolm Gray, passed away from COVID and complications. And some of you will know from reading the utilization-focused evaluation books that we have a character in there called Halcum, which is how come when you say it slowly. And Halcum was actually inspired by my friend Malcolm. As we hiked together, I adopted the term Halcum as a kind of muse or mentor for philosophical ideas. This actually relates to one of the principles, this cartoon relates to one of the principles we're going to talk about today, is being present for the whole journey. And it's in the new edition of the book. So utilization-focused evaluation is the overall context and framework for some of the other evaluation approaches we've developed that some of you are familiar with. Developmental evaluation was developed in response to the needs of a particular foundation client and is about how to do evaluation under conditions of complex dynamic systems. That led to principles-focused evaluation, where principles rather than goals may be the focus of an evaluation. And then most recently, Blue Marble evaluation, which is looking at global transformation, taking a global perspective on global systems transformation. And we often get asked how these things fit together. Utilization-focused evaluation is the overarching framework for all of these other approaches. Each one of them has emerged from meeting the needs of particular people we were working with, stakeholders and clients. And so this is to help anticipate that question, to say everything we do is within a utilization-focused evaluation frame.
And with that, we're going to do a quick Mentimeter poll to kind of get a sense of where folks are joining us from today. So I put the link in the chat. If you go to that link, you should see a question to respond to, or you can go to menti.com and use the code at the top of your screen, 3388390. We've already got folks filling it out.
Yeah, go to menti.com and put in the code. You can share your screen.
Oh, I'm not sharing it. I'm sorry.
You're not sharing it.
I unshared. Okay, here we go.
There we go. Okay, we got people from all over the world. Wonderful. Welcome.
Coming in, give you a few more minutes or a few more seconds here.
Right, Ellen.
True. Artificial boundaries we've got here. All right.
Got some 130 participants, and this gives us a sense of the BOR, a global community, and it's nice to see this.
And we know we have time zone challenges too, which is why we recorded this. So anyone watching the recording, welcome. I don't think you can add things later, but we welcome you too. All right. And our next question is, we'd love to know how you would rate your experience as an evaluator.
We've got some new folks and some old timers. Glad to have everybody along.
We have a random middle option that has no.
Yeah, I
no-
don't, I must have skipped something there.
Oh yeah, nice range here.
Yeah, great.
Welcome to our elders and our young and emerging evaluators alike.
And the option threer.
Yep. All right. And how knowledgeable do you consider yourself about UFE?
Oh, great. So we're right in the sweet spot here where we want to be. Appreciate having some of you highly knowledgeable connect. The new edition of the book is significantly different from past editions, and we'll share with you how that is the case. But it still concludes all the basics. So for those of you who are new to it, we'll bring you up to speed.
All right.
Thank you for responding to those. Gives us a sense of the community.
All right. So we're going to go back to our slides here. And this is you, I think, to talk about MinSpec.
So one of the things that has emerged out of the complexity of our world and interventions, where there are lots of things to do. In the previous edition of the book, we identified 17 steps in a utilization-focused evaluation and lots of things to take into account. And there are utilization-focused evaluation has been around for 50 years now. The first edition of the book came out in 1978. And this is the 5th edition. There's been a new edition about every 10 years. And I get sent lots of studies that say they're utilization focused. I do have a Google alert for evaluations that are utilization focused, and there are a large number of new ones conducted every month. But the idea of min specs, minimum specifications, is with all of those steps, with all the things that you can do and should do, what's the minimum to make something utilization focused? And this comes from the design world as well. What are the minimum specifications to meet design criteria? If you're designing something, what are the minimum things that it has to have? You can think about purchasing a computer. What are the minimum things you want in that computer? Or purchasing a car, renting or buying a house? What are the minimum things you want in that, your criteria? And this becomes important for different kinds of evaluation approaches because it relates to what's come to be known as the fidelity problem. The fidelity problem is people saying they're doing something, but it's not actually clear that they're doing it. How do you demonstrate fidelity to a model? And there's often been several research studies of different approaches where they've looked at evaluations that claimed they were following a certain approach, and often the evidence of following that approach was absent. We run into that same thing with utilization-focused evaluation. It's been around for a long time now. It's an overarching framework that can be used as a part of virtually any evaluation. But often we find that evaluations that call themselves utilization-focused evaluation don't manifest the min specs. So the new edition of the book opens by talking about what are the minimum specifications for something called utilization focus. This idea I first encountered in doing the book shown on your upper right called Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed, that I wrote with 2 Canadian colleagues about the criteria for how you bring about change in a complex dynamic system. And we were, one of those co-authors, Brenda Zimmerman, brought the idea of min specs into our work. So we're going to begin, and this initial webinar will be about min specs, and then the rest of the year, we're going to do one principle of the 10 in the book each month. This
There's a
cartoon
little,
shows the difference between a detailed, comprehensive, complete guide to everything you should do versus going for min specs. And in this increasingly fast-paced world, min specs are the place to begin. It doesn't mean you don't want to get to the other parts, but min specs, especially for those of you who are new to this, is a great place to start.
so I'll just walk us through the 5 min specs to start, and then we'll go into depth with each one for the next period of time that we have together. So the first UFE min spec is honor the personal factor, identify and engage primary users. Be purpose-driven, focus on priority intended uses. Facilitate process use. Be active, reactive, interactive, adaptive in engaging users in all aspects of the evaluation. Fourth is take a full journey stance, focus on use from beginning to end and every step along the way. And adapt to context changes. When the context for an evaluation changes, the evaluation may need to change. And here's another, for those who are more visual way of seeing this. So we've got our primary intended users plus our primary intended uses. The engagement of the users and that focus of that engagement on use throughout. How will everything from beginning to end be done? With that monitoring and adapting to context. So now I'll turn it back to Michael to start with number 1, honor the personal factor.
Thank you, Charmaine. So from the beginning, in 1970s, I became director of a evaluation methodology training program at the University of Minnesota, one of the first such training programs for both doctoral and postdoctoral students. And we decided to undertake research on use as a way to look at how to integrate our own learning together. And we studied US federal evaluations that were going on at the time. And we looked at a wide range of possible factors that would explain whether or not evaluations were used. The methodologies used, the kind of findings, the budget, the size of the evaluation, the nature of the program. We had about 20 factors that we looked at. But the most important factor that turned up time and time again in our studies of use was not on our list of things we were actually looking at. And we ended up calling that the personal factor. And in retrospect, it seems fairly straightforward, but it actually has deep implications. The personal factor is the notion that people care about the evaluation. It's that simple, that minimum spec, to find people who are interested in, care about, and want to use information. So that means that the first step in utilization-focused evaluation is actually identifying and engaging, having interaction with primary, what we call primary intended users. These are people who are interested in being involved, who are knowledgeable, who are open to evaluation and the process of learning, who are connected to important stakeholder constituencies so they can represent them, who have credibility in the eyes of those stakeholders, who are teachable and open to learning about utilization-focused evaluation, and ideally committed and available for interaction throughout the evaluation process. So 2 key pieces here of honoring the personal factor, identifying these people and engaging them. Utilization-focused evaluation is an interpersonal engagement, collaborative co-creation process with primary intended users, not just sort of obtuse or abstract agencies. People will say who's the evaluation for, and they'll say, well, it's for the federal government, or it's for the state government, or the provincial government, or it's for the ministry, or it's for the agency, or it's for the board. We're talking about identifying concrete, real people who you know the names of and you can engage with in an interpersonal way throughout the evaluation to determine the focus of the evaluation, which is the next min spec.
which is the next MinSpec. But first, we're going to give another example, which is, or an example of the personal factor. So Michael and I have been working together for a couple of years now with the Minnesota Humanities Center, which is an organization that is working to really bring the humanities to look at how to bring people together, communities together, and change systems based on really recognizing the humanity in all of us. And they work in different systems. In particular, we've been looking at the education system in Minnesota with them. And one of the things that we have really been helping them to do and working with everyone at the center itself is to really think about this personal factor and how to bring the multiple different stakeholders from the system, superintendents, principals, teachers, students, parents together. And that's something that they really focus on in their work, this narrative storytelling approach that they have. And so we're trying to help them really embed that into their evaluation as well. And to identify those primary intended users who are really going to care about this work and who can help learn about how systems change and how to bring those individuals, communities, and systems together into that evaluation approach. So that's just one example of kind of how we've been working with the personal factor. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Just that, as I commented earlier, when I get sent a lot of evaluations or look at evaluations that call themselves utilization focused or are published, the first thing you look for is who is the evaluation for? And a lot of evaluations that call themselves utilization focused evaluation present the purpose of the evaluation and the findings and never say who it was for and how it was used.
Yep. So MinSpec 2 is be purpose driven. And as Michael said, use flows from that clarity of purpose. So different people, program staff, policy makers, funders need information for different purposes. So the purpose of improvement is different from the purpose of overall effectiveness. Accountability evaluations determine whether a program did what it was supposed to do and use the resources appropriately. Developmental evaluations support innovation and adaptation in complexity and dynamic systems. Knowledge generation and learning helps to create lessons learned and contribute to the growth of a field. So being clear about an evaluation's purpose is central to evaluating an evaluation. And the primary intended users, going back to the first MinSpec, should be deeply involved in reviewing and prioritizing the evaluation options and clarifying that primary purpose and the intended uses of the evaluation. So lack of clarity really inhibits the evaluation's utility and use. And so one of the ways that you can begin by explaining the importance of getting clear is to kind of give an example. I think Michael mentioned before, if you're going to buy a car, you have lots of choices. How the car will be used, what features are critical, who is going to help you find the car, and what in our current reality, what is the mileage of the car? How environmentally friendly is the car? All those things, like what are your priorities? What is the purpose? And so giving folks an example, a real life example, or coming up with their own real life example of when they've had to really think about the primary purpose of a decision-making process that they're going through can help. And so the other thing is to really surface forthcoming decisions. So really thinking about not creating an evaluation based on some artificial timeline, but creating it around this idea of making decisions. Like, what is the evaluation going to inform? So what decisions might be coming up? When will the decisions be made? By whom? Who has a stake in the decisions? What is the history and context around the decision-making process? What are other factors that will affect decision-making? Really focusing on that idea can help the primary intended users really get clear about the evaluation purpose and how the evaluation will be used. So we've got another example for you, I believe. from the Blanding Community Leadership Program, Michael.
Yeah, this is a program in Minnesota to train leaders in rural communities that involves selecting a group of these rural leaders to go into a residential training program for a week and get training in how to read community indicators, how to design program improvement projects in their communities and community development projects, increase their communication skills, their political skills, their analytical skills. And so this is a program that we began with a contract to do 2.5 years of improvement-oriented work with them, followed by 2.5 years of what's called summative evaluation to decide if the overall program was effective and should be continued. And during that first 2.5 years, they made a lot of changes. We used a lot of different approaches. We did case studies, we did interviews, we followed people back to their communities to see what they did. We did key informant interviews. We participated in the program to see how it unfolded. And they made lots of improvements. And then when we moved to the summative evaluation to make a final decision about whether they were going to continue, it turned out the foundation had already made that decision. There was no question that this program was popular. It was well supported. It fit with the mission of the foundation. But what they needed to do was be able to adapt it to changing conditions, to continue to adapt it. And so we moved from the purpose of doing a final judgment evaluation to developmental evaluation, ongoing adaptation. The purpose changed, and we had to get clear with everybody then that that was the nature of the change, and there wasn't going to be some final model that was generalizable and scalable that was fixed, but rather it would be an ongoing adaptation. And that is a very different purpose. The other key thing to highlight from Charmaine's introduction of this principle is that in many cases, indeed, historically, in most cases, the evaluator would determine the purpose and decide what ought to be looked at and what was going to be done based upon the evaluator's perceptions of what was needed. In utilization-focused evaluation, it's that identification and engagement with the intended users and then engaging with them around purpose. That means it is a co-created decision. And so identification of primary intended users and working with them around priority purposes go together. No evaluation can do everything. It can't meet all of the possible purposes there are. So there's a need for focus, and that's the utilization focus.
You want to take us into the third MINSPEC?
In the third edition of utilization-focused evaluation, looking back over evaluations of evaluations and our ongoing research on evaluation, we discovered something that was there all the time, but we hadn't seen before. When we follow up evaluations and ask people how they were used, they would say, well, we used this finding and this recommendation, this other one kind of fell by the wayside, and we'd go through and look at what was used, but then they would say, but what was really useful was going through the evaluation process and learning how to think and use evaluation. And we'd say, well, that's great. Glad you like the process. Tell us more about how you used the findings. But it became clear as we looked at the data that using findings was only one part of the impact of an evaluation. Process use refers to the effects of people, on people, of going through the evaluation process, of being involved in deciding what the purpose of the evaluation are, being involved in choosing methods, being involved in interpreting the data, being involved in thinking about use throughout. And so that came to be called process use, working with intended users, not only to get findings, but to learn to think evaluatively, to make doing evaluation part of the business, the way of doing business, not just generating findings. And since that time, in the last 2 decades, process use has become increasingly important in evaluation. It's become widely recognized as an important use of evaluation. It increases the cost benefit of evaluation because findings get out of date quickly. Findings get old quickly, but learning how to think evaluatively endures and can help make evaluations part of the way of thinking and doing business over the long term for a program or organization. That's what process use is.
And we have this sort of facilitation cycle. There's Michael wrote a whole book on facilitating evaluation around this idea of being active, reactive, interactive, and adaptive. So being active is identifying and getting to know the primary intended users, setting the agenda, framing questions, facilitating that group process. Being reactive is designing and reacting to kind of what comes out of the group, using language that is meaningful, dealing with problems, assessing where the group's at. Being interactive is this idea of, bringing your whole self to the process, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second. And then being adaptive is changing the process as needed, really responding to what's happening, not being rigid in your agenda, but adapting to the flow to ensure that tasks are completed and that you're moving towards your desired outcome. And so I'm going to turn it back to Michael to talk about this interpersonal factor.
And so part of what's emerging is that the characteristics and the backgrounds of people very much affect this kind of engagement. Jaradine Coffey is one of the thought leaders in evaluation who's written a great deal about the way in which our backgrounds, personal and cultural, a culturally responsive evaluation that has emerged as a major approach, is an appreciation that different people bring different perspectives to bear. And so utilization focused is very much an interpersonal process, working with groups of intended users. And that means that one of the skills of utilization focused evaluators is to be able to work with diverse people and to identify inclusively diverse people who are part of the stakeholder constituencies involved and facilitate their interaction. So it's very much a facilitated kind of process, and facilitation skills is one of the key things that are needed. The Equitable Evaluation Initiative, makes a case for all evaluations addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's certainly consistent with utilization-focused evaluation. I've just been working on the United Nations Food Systems Summit last year, which was looking at how to deal with world hunger, with the sustainability issues around agriculture and food. And as we did that work, there were dialogues that took place around the world about food systems. And we took a deep dive into those dialogues, analyzed what the patterns were, came up with a theory of transformation, worked with decision makers in the world food organizations, and Charmaine was engaged in doing some focus groups with some of the dialogues that focus particularly on women. You want?
So, I engaged a group of women who had facilitated dialogues to get their sense of sort of what were the main themes that had come out of those dialogues. And I did this with Donna Podoms from South Africa, and we just had a conversation about the dialogues and connected the women to one another. And one of the things that was powerful about that process was that it allowed them to sort of see how their own dialogue fit within the bigger picture of the Food Systems Summit. And these, there were so many dialogues happening around the world, but there wasn't a lot that was connecting them to one another. And so it was very clear from that process that they wanted more of that connection, not just the process of being part of a focus group and engaging with one another was powerful to help them start to see the connections and think about what they could do together and how they could take that work forward. So beyond just providing us with feedback about the themes that emerged in their dialogue that we could then share, it also really gave them a sense of what they could do collectively to bring particularly women's issues in food systems more to the forefront. But also just a real desire to do more of that connecting with one another. All right. Anything else you want to say about that?
Let me quickly respond to a couple of the questions in
Sure.
chat that are relevant to what we're talking about. One of the questions is whether this is different for internal and external evaluators. The MinSpec principles are not different. Whether you're internal or external, we're arguing that you need to know who the evaluation is for. Even internal evaluators may be working on evaluations or often commissioning evaluations that have to do with other stakeholders, that have to do with participants in the program, or have to do with particular staff, or particular decisions that are going to be made, or particular decisions a board is going to make. So identifying the priorities of users and uses applies to both internal and external evaluations, and especially process use. One of the ways as an internal evaluator, you really make yourself valuable is to have people be learning from the evaluation who you work with internally. The other question that came up was dealing with predetermined mandates when organizations have predetermined their goals and are looking to evaluator to simply find out whether or not they've met those goals. What we do is, even within a goals-based evaluation, there's still different ways of approaching the goals. It's learning about them. It's seeing what the disaggregated data tells you about different kinds of populations that you may focus on. It may be developmental in adapting those goals to different contexts. And so what we want to do and recommend is that even where there appears to be a predetermined design, we don't take on that work unless there's an openness to engagement. And that's been a longstanding piece. We're not just interested in doing the work in a predetermined way. The MinSpecs then mean we're always engaging around how things actually are going to get used and who they're for. Go ahead, Charmaine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in responding to sort of a traditional RFP, sometimes the response has to be that you can't design the evaluation, like they ask for an evaluation design in the response, and if we're going to do that, we would push back and say, like, this is preliminary, or we can't do the design until we know who the primary intended users are and it's co-created, and that's how we respond. And if that's not what they want, then they wouldn't select us. But if it is what they want, it can make them change their thinking about what they're asking for to begin with. So part of it is getting creative in how you're responding to the RFPs. And I think too, with this follow-up question, that's also really something that is hard to get into at the RFP stage, but making it clear that engagement of stakeholders and primary intended users is going to be a core part of the process, and that you get into that conversation when you begin about who else needs to be involved and how to engage them. It's about how do you then make space for that? How do you establish that trust? And sometimes that's, as an external evaluator, one of the things that you can do a little bit easier if you're representing the actual commissioner versus if you're representing an external organization. Sometimes it can be easier to make stakeholders who are uncomfortable with the commissioner kind of feel more comfortable about participating, knowing, with some guarantees that you're going to represent their perspectives.
And the whole idea of MinSpecs is to say that not all evaluations are utilization focused. So if you can't do these things for whatever reasons, then it's not a utilization focused evaluation. Compliance evaluations, going through the motions, just doing the paperwork, completing a predetermined design that is outside of the scope of utilization-focused evaluation, it means you're doing something else. And that's part of the reason for identifying min specs is, are we actually doing a utilization-focused evaluation?
So our fourth min spec is to take a full journey stamp, focus on use from beginning to end and every stage along the way. So we started the webinar, for those of you who hopped on a little bit early, with Curtis Mayfield's song, People Get Ready, which we also quote in the book as a way to kind of capture this idea of a journey, that we're all on this journey together. And so it's important to pay attention to what's developing along that journey. It really begins by meeting those key intended users, our fellow travelers, to learn about the organization, the political context. Sometimes we do that one-on-one with some, pre-conversations or interviews, or, that can be done in a larger group setting. And really invite people to come together in sort of an opening workshop, opening meeting, to identify, who is going to be involved, and start to facilitate a common understanding of an evaluative mindset among who will be involved and affected. And sometimes you have to do that a few times as more people come along. And during that first meeting, you identify other people who should be involved. And so again, it's sort of that getting a sense of laying the foundation for readiness and engagement. And then, following that along with reflection and adaptation, process use, which we've talked about. And then you get to findings use, but findings use is not just, as Michael said, the only thing that we're looking for. And so really thinking about some of that follow-up and really looking at, producing reports is not use. Use is what's actually happening as a result of the evaluation. What has been done with those findings to change things? What has been done what decisions have been made? And so one of the things that, going back to the RFP stage, one of the things that often happens is that an evaluation contract ends at the report. And so part of what we recommend is building in that follow-up as part of the evaluation contract, that it doesn't end with that report writing, that there's more conversations that can happen after it, or a conversation at least about how to support that follow-up and use that can really provide opportunities for broader dissemination and more robust use. So Michael, you want to talk about this example, or anything else you want to say first?
I was just going to say the two big breakthroughs here is that people often don't worry about use until they get to the end. They think that, that once you have findings, you worry about use. The point here is that you're tilling the field as a farmer does before planting the seeds. So use begins right from the beginning. It's not something you take care of at the end. And then, as Charmaine said, building in time and budgeting to follow up findings makes a huge difference. Findings don't get used automatically. They need facilitation as well. The example that we wanted to draw on is work that's being done by colleagues in New Zealand around a program for health and recreation in relation to Maori culture there. And that initiative, which has been going on now for a number of years, has engaged work from the very beginning of the initiative. The evaluators have been a part of the initiative on the journey from the beginning, working with communities, working with the people in the emergence of what it means to engage in health and recreation as Maori people in New Zealand, and continuing to work with them as findings emerged in different communities as they came together for collective learning, and then changing and adapting the program over time. And so the notion of simply doing a project mentality, that we do it and we're done, is very different from seeing this as a journey of collaboration as you work with people introducing and working on an initiative from the beginning as they continue to adapt, which brings us to our final piece.
am I doing this one? Okay, so yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this already, but the last min spec is adapting to context changes. So when a context changes, the evaluation may need to change. And so as we mentioned, including follow-up in an evaluation design and RFP, also including language about the fact that significant changes in context may lead to changes in the evaluation. And think about in advance, how might you know that? What processes might you use to make those decisions? Then also to be paying attention to things that are happening in the wider world, in the funding community, in the system in which you're working, organizational leadership, political or economic changes. And then the third is for, as the evaluator, to be open to change. So relevance is contextual, use is contextual. It is often easier to continue doing what is already planned, but that is unlikely to be useful for you. I'm currently working on a evaluation design for an organization, a principles-focused evaluation design for an organization in Canada that does youth civic engagement work. And we started with this developmental evaluation approach where they were really working to understand how to continue to develop and innovate this program that they'd been running for a number of years. We did sort of a retrospective, and then we're starting to get into that prospective process of developmental evaluation when they found out that the funding for that program is going to be cut. And so kind of transitioning from a developmental evaluation where they're learning and adapting to continue that program to really actually taking more of a knowledge generation piece where they want to take what they're learning from that program, from what they've done, and potentially turn it into something else. And so we've been talking, they kind of were like, well, you've set this up, so let's just keep doing it. And I was the one who was like, I'm not sure that makes sense. Let's really think about how you're going to use this process and use this information and adapt it. And so sometimes it's the evaluator who's going to kind of have to bring that to the table as the context changes. So it's just something to be aware of as things are happening. And obviously right now, in the context of the coronavirus and COVID, we're all adapting and pivoting much more than we ever used to. And this is these 15 points about how evaluation implications of the coronavirus pandemic were published on a blog nearly 2 years ago now, I think. Do you want to talk about them, Michael?
Well, you can read through them here, but it is to reinforce the point that we're increasingly in a complex, dynamic world. Not only the coronavirus, where everybody's had to pivot, but Charmaine and I are coming to you from Minnesota, as noted at the beginning of the presentation, in the north central part of the United States, where George Floyd was murdered last year. And that had a huge effect upon the programs that we were working with, social justice movement that came out of that. And so the combination of the pandemic and the social justice uprising worldwide, these became contextual issues, as well as the political polarization that is going on, and other contextual factors that mean that we can't treat utilization-focused evaluations as closed systems endeavors. They are open system endeavors that are affected by the things going on around. And being prepared to note those and how that may change things is a core principle, a min spec.
All right. Well, those are the 5 min specs. And we're going to open it up. We've got about 10 minutes left for some responses and reactions. We have one final Mentimeter where we can begin that. So you can go again to, share this again, to menti.com and enter the code 33882390. Or if you're still on your Menti, it should show up for you. And feel free to put in reactions, questions, or comments, or if you're if you'd rather do it in the chat, feel free. It looks like we've got one. Michael, if you want to monitor the chat.
Yeah. Elizabeth is asking from a very practical point of view, how do you budget to be able to make room for the potential adaptation of the evaluation process to changing context? Do you usually reopen the budget at some point, or do you have some other strategy? A couple of things. We have found it's wise in any evaluation to build in contingency funds, not to pre-specify all the budget is allocated to everything. This is not only to be able to make adaptations, it's also necessary to explore unanticipated consequences. If all the money goes into predetermined design, you don't have a place to do open-ended work around what may be unanticipated, what new needs are emerging, what new challenges are emerging. And so I like to see at least 20% of an evaluation budget to be contingency. The other piece is opening things up. I've talked to builders and architects who say they regularly do change orders when in the midst of a project. They have a design, they have a blueprint, but as a project unfolds, the people see what the space looks like, there's new technology, there are new options. It's common to do change orders. Likewise in the legal world, you may begin thinking you have a certain legal problem. Perhaps you're getting a divorce and you think it's fairly simple, but then it turns out that the two partners are in different states or in different countries, or their assets they hadn't taken into account. It gets complicated. Lawyers, accountants work on contingency fees, so they add money as things get more complicated, as do health professionals. So there are analogies here for the openness that comes with being able to be agile with evaluation.
Yeah. We've had a few reactions and comments, really appreciate them. We also have another question about the virtual engagement and whether it's been more challenging to elicit buy-in or response. I've found, I think both have been true. In some ways, it's been easier to engage users because the sort of bar for engagement is a little lower when you can do so from your living room versus having to go to a place. And particularly when we're working in global settings like the Food System Summit, being able to bring people from around the world together in a focus group would have been extremely challenging and expensive. But in the era of COVID, doing a virtual focus group, we could have done that not in COVID era, but people are so much more used to it, I think, now that it becomes a little bit easier to connect and engage. At the same time, there are certainly barriers. Not everyone can use Zoom or virtual spaces. There's still a lot of accessibility challenges. So I think it's a both and, but I have found I'm currently working with a group of about 16 users from a number of different countries. And, I couldn't have the level of engagement that I would want without a virtual space with them. Michael, anything to add there?
No, that last point's really critical. It's able, as this webinar suggests, to have people from around the world, major international projects with stakeholders in different places in different countries and at different levels. It's actually, the virtual space has opened up the potential for engagement. And Mentimeter, by the way, is one of the technologies we use in facilitating a utilization-focused evaluation. It allows people in larger groups to make inputs anonymously. It makes it possible to get everybody's voice heard, so you don't get the problem of one or two people being dominant. You can use Mentimeter to get everybody's inclusive points of view, do summaries. And there are a lot of these technologies that are emerging now. So that's one of the skill challenges that's emerged with this time, is being able to use online technologies for facilitation.
And there's a follow-up question about accessibility, those most marginalized, not connected. And I do think that one of the things we saw with the Food System Summit was a real attempt to give a lot of different options around engagement. And some of the dialogues were virtual, but some of them were still, out in communities and having partners who were connected to those rural communities to be able to bring people together and then summarize their perspectives and take them to that next level. So I do think that, certainly when you're thinking about communities that are less connected digitally or more remote, it's important to think about how you can engage people, within those local communities to be sort of act as an evaluator, do some of that capacity building to help them gather data and help feed that back, and then make sure that that gets brought back to those communities as well. So do you want to talk at all about that, Michael, how that worked or what you saw in that process?
I think a key part of that, and we talk about this in the facilitation group, is to not take on the burden yourself of trying to figure out how to engage people who've been whose voices haven't traditionally been heard, who have particular challenges of disabilities or access to technology, but in fact, to make the commitment to engage with them about what it would take to engage them. How do they want to be involved? What kind of differences would in the process would help them to be involved? So that becomes part of that early inquiry with them, is to not predetermine their engagement, but to ask them, how can we engage you? To reinforce how important their engagement is, how important their perspective is, and to find out from them and people who advocate within those communities and know those communities, what are the ways of engaging them? That's a commitment to be sure that you are able to engage multiple stakeholders, is build with the people who you want to engage to how they want to be engaged, and work with people who know those communities to figure out how to make that happen. What happens when there's stakeholder resistance? It depends upon the nature of the resistance, but part of what I work with Charmaine is a change in psychology, and that is a kind of reverse psychology. And I've been at this now for more than 50 years. I don't try to sell people on evaluation. I treat evaluation as a resource. And so instead of, when somebody tries to convince you this is really good for you, you ought to do it, the reaction is sort of, I don't know. But if I say, look, here's what we've learned, here's what we're going to try to do. If you find this useful, we'll be willing to help you. If you don't, then we've got other things to do. So I don't take on the burden of trying to convince somebody that they ought to pay attention to information and data to try to improve what they're doing. That's on them. I will show them what the options are. We'll take them through what other people have learned, take them through examples. But what I have found is that resistors are really good at resisting. That's their niche they've taken on. And so I don't try to overcome that resistance. It's more of a Zen, building on that, going with it, honoring it, and saying, perhaps it's another time. Let's part ways. And often that then takes them to, well, wait a minute now. I didn't mean not do it. I was just trying to be clear. And I often find then that when I accept the resistance and say, I'm out of here, they said, no, I didn't mean not doing it. And it puts the onus on them to then I say, well, I've got other things to do. I need to hear from you that you're really prepared to be committed to this process if you really want to do it. So the reverse psychology is to get them wanting to do it, not me wanting them to do it. That doesn't work. And we're consultants. So that's the difference in that, is we can say, we've got other things to do. Do you really want to do this? And find that match. And I find that giving that authority and power to people to decide they want to be a part of it helps increase the commitment.
I know there were questions we didn't get to, so we'll look through them and send out some answers. Michael will be continuing to do his YouTube vlogs every day, so you can follow him, and then we'll hope to see many of you back here. We're gonna work to do the third Wednesday of every month moving forward, so that will be in mid-March will be our next webinar. Hopefully you've signed up for that, or if not, you can find that on our website. We'll be sure to share additional resources there as well, and I'll send out an email with the recording and links to some of the additional questions. So really appreciate you being with us. Here's the YouTube channel if you'd like to subscribe, and looking forward to seeing you all here next time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.